Great. All right. Yes. Hello and welcome to another edition of the Chicago Brewseum Book Club. Yes. And my name's Lucas. I'm on the board of Chicago Brewseum. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Bill Savage, professor at Northwestern University, member of the Chicago Brewseum's, the National Advisory Board, right? Yes. And the also, Bill, this is your third time for the virtual happy hours with the Chicago Brewseum, I do believe. So, I think we need a five timers club, right? So I want to get you a monogram bathrobe and all of that, and get access to the VIP lounge. So real exclusive, right?
I'll skip the bathrobe. I'll take the VIP lounge.
Okay, great. Or maybe there's a bottle of beer with your name on it. So
maybe.
Excellent. All right. Maybe. No, definitely. Guaranteed. So fantastic. Well, we are here to discuss Ernest Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises and etc. Life and times of the drinking culture, drinking scene, and the people around that period in that Ernest Hemingway is writing about and thinking about and living amongst. So we are also, I should say, in theory, live streaming to Facebook on the Chicago Brewseum's Facebook page. This is the first time test with that. So we'll see how that goes. Yeah, there I think, Bill, and thank you again. I'm really pleased to, and let's also say, in the chat box, we can all chime in with what we're enjoying, what beverages we have here, or also you can unmute yourself and speak up. But in general, throughout most of this, once I turn things over to Bill, we're gonna for the most part stay muted, and until we get towards the end there, and when we'll have the opportunity to unmute ourselves. I'll certainly leave that up to Bill's discretion, however he wants to manage that. Fantastic, Bill. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Liz, did you want to chime in with Brewseum profile-y thing or no?
That'd be great.
No, I think you're good to go. I'm just going to participate this time, thankfully.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. I see some familiar faces. Hi, Margaret. Hi, Eileen. Hi, other people who I probably know, but you aren't showing your face, which is fine. Save that pixel space for whatever other, internet you need to have coming in. The plan for today is I want to talk about Ernest Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, 1926, one of the founding texts of modernism per se, but also American modernism in particular. And my plot is to go through some larger contexts, kind of give you a brief cultural outline of what Hemingway was up to, the world he perceived himself being in. I'm going to talk a little bit about material that might not be familiar even to those of you who've read the novel, which is that there were two unpublished chapters that Hemingway cut at the suggestion of F. Scott Fitzgerald that have some interesting drink-related things in them. And then dive into some details from the novel as they relate to the drinking culture of both the expatriates in Paris and the Basque peasant culture. And I just want to say a quick word about that word. It's not meant in any kind of pejorative way. The linguistic roots of that just means someone from the country. It's come to have a class meaning to it now and kind of a pejorative meaning, but that's not the way Hemingway would have intended it, and it's not the way I think we should understand it. Another way to talk about the drinking culture in this novel could be to talk about it as the city versus the country, which would be, the urbanites in Paris versus the peasants in the countryside. So when I use the term peasant, I just want that to be sort of on top of things. So the context that I want to put it in, and then again, we'll have some chat. And I'm going to not look at the Zoom group chat while this is happening, because then I'm going to get too distracted. I got to look at my notes in the novel because I'll be reading passages from stuff. I also need to clear up the rest of my desktop so I'm not looking at other things. So the three contexts I want to put this in, I've already mentioned the sort of expatriate culture of Americans and Brits and Scots in Paris. Also Prohibition, and the meaning of Prohibition to Americans who were abroad in Europe during the 20s. And the biggest context, which is what I'm going to begin with, is the sort of the crisis of the modern world that Hemingway and other writers in the 20s saw themselves as responding to. So this is a very abbreviated version of a graduate seminar I teach. You can send your tuition checks to me directly, or you could, Northwestern might need the money too. You might want to just send it to them.
On camera.
So the crisis of the modern here. When we talk about modernism, it's something that happened in every art form. It's something that maybe people tend to think of as one of those moments that, like, we're Victorian, then we're modernist, and it's really not that way. Modernism was a confluence of a lot of cultural phenomenon that have been going on in some cases for centuries, in others relatively recently or rapidly from the point of view of the 1920s. And that all come to a culmination with the carnage of the Great War. And notice I'm not calling it World War I. I'll get to the reason for that in a moment. But basically, we can look at the world Hemingway was writing in as a world where the question of what things meant, could anything mean anything, was fundamentally on the table. A solid, stable sense of progress and of being somewhere meaningful had been eroding and getting chipped away from the highest levels of sort of intellectual discourse down to the nitty-gritty of the streets people walk down. From the highest level, you can think of the crisis of the modern as being a series of ideas that decentered old, reliable ways of thinking about life. At the highest level, Einstein's theory of relativity. And not that everybody on the street was talking about Einstein all the time, but he was known. This was in the atmosphere. The reliable Newtonian universe was no more. Space and time were kind of one thing, and gravity could bend space? What are you talking about here? This is scary stuff. Where you stand is going to determine how you measure something. That's a frightening idea. And it's an idea that was growing in the early 20th century. Meanwhile, going back to the mid-19th century, Darwin was the universe is not as stable as we thought it was, and the human race is not a special creation above the animals and below the angels. We're just another species of primate, and we evolved just like everybody else. This is still being argued about in one country on the planet that we happen to be mostly in, I think. The rest of the world has accepted this idea, or the rest of the Western world has accepted this idea. And at the time, in the early 20th century, it was coming into force. So the universe is crazy, the human race isn't special. Human societies, Marx argued, weren't stable, unified things. They were essentially a series of conflicts over economic class status. Freud said the same thing about our psychology. We didn't have a singular unitary personality that was who we were. Instead, we have, okay, someone has shifted my view, that's fine. Instead, we were or we are, as human beings, fundamentally conflicted. The drive between the ego, the id, and the superego, or the conflict between the ego and the id and the superego, all going on at the same time. And, our brain, we aren't just who we are. We have this internal conflict. All of these different categories have conflict built into them. And then have a side of Nietzsche with God is dead for the big ideas. Meanwhile, issues that had been culminating for a long time, the transformation of Western cultures from primarily agricultural to primarily urban, the industrialization of work, which goes along with that transformation, and the mechanization of all sorts of things. Typewriters are really a powerful image at this time. The transformation of textual production into something done by machines. Even if people are doing it, there's this mechanization happening. And then, the metaphor or the cliche is always the straw that broke the camel's back. In reality, it's more like the railroad tie that broke the camel's back. And that would be the Great War. And here, I think it's important to remember that history can obscure as much as it can reveal. Because the Second World War is more recent and to some people alive today still a living memory, and because the horrors of that war were so much of a higher magnitude perhaps than the horrors of the First War, we forget how traumatic the Great War was for Western culture. You know, the atom bomb and the Holocaust make us forget how bad the machine gun and the trenches were on the Western Front. But during the Great War, where Hemingway served as an ambulance driver and was injured, and where he witnessed, you know, a lot of the horror firsthand, even if he wasn't a soldier per se, there was a real sense of the Western world coming to an end. Until the U.S. entered the war and Russia withdrew after the Soviet Revolution, there were people arguing that it's going to be like the 100 Years' War, that it's just not going to stop because it had been a stalemate for so very long. And I won't delve into any of the statistics for things like the Battle of the Somme, where for every man who was killed, the British gained an inch of ground over a 6-month battle. I guess I just lied. I did give you a statistic. But people at the time were genuinely convinced that the world might come to an end. And this led to aesthetic innovation. When you're living in a world where the old art forms have been proven to be inadequate to the new world that you live in, you can't have romantic poetry talking about war anymore. You know, Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade just isn't going to fly after the Battle of the Somme. And novels where writers hand you meaning on a silver platter, the way even realists like Theodore Dreiser did, isn't going to fly. And Hemingway was at the forefront of innovating in prose, in part because of what I call the modernist distrust of language. And that's best expressed in a passage from his third novel, but his second real great novel, Farewell to Arms. And this is one of his more autobiographical books. They're all kind of autobiographical. But it's from the point of view of an American ambulance driver in the Italian army. And he's talking with a friend of his about how the food might be at the next place they're going to be stationed. And Frederick Henry, his alter ego, says, yes, food can't win a war, but it can lose one. And his Italian buddy replies, we won't talk of losing. There's enough talk about losing. What has been done this summer cannot have been done in vain. And the internal narration goes on. I did not say anything. I was always embarrassed by the words sacred, glorious, and sacrifice, and the expression in vain. We had heard them sometimes standing in the rain, almost out of earshot, so that only the shouted words came through, and had read them on proclamations that were slapped up by bill posters over other proclamations, now for a long time. And I had seen nothing sacred, and the things that were glorious had no glory, and the sacrifices were like the stockyards at Chicago if nothing was done with the meat except to bury it. There were many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally only the names of places had dignity. Certain numbers were the same way, and certain dates, and these with the names of the places were all you could say and have them mean anything. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of the roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates. So anytime a writer depicts a character expressing an opinion about language, you should pay attention, especially Hemingway, who was trying to do new things with language. So when Frederick Henry responds, I did not say anything, that exposes what I call the fundamental modernist distrust of language. Language had been used, abstract language, political language, religious language, to justify slaughtering human beings the way we slaughtered animals in the stockyards of Chicago. And so you could not continue to use language the same way. You had to, as Ezra Pound put it, make it new. You had to do something different. The details in this passage are fascinating too, like the hearing it out of earshot, out of range in the rain is like you're standing there being forced to listen to propaganda speeches or looking at the posters, bill posters that put up one over the other. Language was perverted by the governments and the other power structures that let the war happen and let the war continue throughout the brutality that it represented. So Hemingway, in part because of his journalistic training, and I'm not going to dwell on that too much, although it has to do with telegrams and how many words you have to pay for. You pay in 10-word increments. So you learn to cut all the unnecessary words. But Hemingway comes up with an aesthetic that's based on simply describing what's going on, just the facts, just describe what's happening. Don't say what it means. Leave it for the reader to figure out. And for those of us who are English majors, that's what we think of as reading in college, right? Close reading, looking for hidden meanings, all that kind of stuff. That was revolutionary 100 years ago. Up to that point, writers would tell you what they thought, and afterwards with the Beat Generation and other counter-modernist movements, writers would tell you what they thought. But Hemingway believed in what he called the iceberg theory. And here I'm going to read a couple of brief bits from just a thing I put together, sort of taking out moments when he talks about things. He talks about being a writer. If a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of the movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. A writer who omits things because he does not know them only makes hollow places in his writing. In another interview, he says, I've seen the marlins mate to know about that, so I leave that out. I've seen a school or pod of more than 50 sperm whales in that same stretch of water, and once harpooned one nearly 60 feet in length and lost him. So I left that out. All the stories I know from the fishing village I leave out, but the knowledge is what makes the underwater part of the iceberg. And I would say here, Hemingway knew about drinking, right? He came from a family with alcohol problems. He himself had a serious alcohol problem. And so when he describes scenes of drink, he's just giving you what's happening, but there's a layer underneath that it's our job to kind of pull up or disinter. That's the job of the reader in modernism, is to make the meaning. Because the writers like Hemingway and Eliot, Dos Passos, others, didn't want to make the same mistake that the prior generation had made, which was thinking they'd figured it out and handing it to you. You have to make meaning because the world is otherwise potentially meaningless. So in the novel, there's lots of depictions of boozing. There was also a lot of that in his short story collection, In Our Time, which precedes Sun Also Rises by, I think, 3 or 4 years. And the reviewers noticed this. So there's a great publication that I rely on immensely called Book Review Digest, which is in Northwestern's library, which I miss immensely. And the summary, this is a thing put out by Publishers Weekly, basically, the equivalent of that in the past. And here is the description of the novel from, that leads into then they quote from a bunch of different reviews. We are introduced to a group of English and American drifters on the continent who have the money and the time to blow where they list, from the boulevards of Paris to the bullfights of Spain, bathing, eating, and drinking the while. The characters bathe, by which they mean like go to the beach. The characters bathe and eat much of the time. They make love part of the time, but they never stop drinking. So that's like the initial people in charge of sort of the official reviewing of this novel hooked up right away on the depiction of drinking and the boozing culture. So it's unfair to Hemingway to some degree to make use of these unpublished first chapters, which were put out in Antaeus in 1979, a literary journal that I believe is still coming out. But basically this was a couple of chapters that Hemingway cut based on F. Scott Fitzgerald, who at that point in time was a much more successful and admired novelist. And they were sort of Parisian buddies, even though Hemingway was notoriously a jealous prick about that sort of thing. But basically he gave Fitzgerald the manuscript of the novel, and Fitzgerald read it and suggested cutting the first, actually 6 chapters, but he only cut the first 2. And it's really a good thing because the first line otherwise would be, this is a novel about a lady. And you know, that's really that Victorian self-consciousness. That Victorian, here, this is, I'm telling you what this book is about, that Hemingway was trying to get away from. So Fitzgerald gave him some good advice, but there's a couple of moments of description regarding 2 of the main characters, Mike Campbell and Brett Lady Ashley, who drink a lot in this book. That is sort of a direct description of how Hemingway was thinking about alcohol at the time. That is definitely worth sharing, so I'm sharing it. And again, I think that with the iceberg theory in mind, we're supposed to be able to infer these things from what Hemingway actually left in the novel as published. And I kind of think it's possible and it's there, but sometimes it's nice to just have something handed to you. So it makes it a little easier. So this is a description of Mike Campbell. undischarged bankrupt, fiance of Jake's, the narrator, Jake Barnes, is the love of his life. We can never have for reasons I'll get to shortly. But this is Mike. Mike was a charming companion and one of the most charming, Mike was a charming companion, one of the most charming. He was nice and he was weak, and he had a certain hard gentleness in him that could not be touched, and that never disappeared until the liquor dissolved him entirely. Mike sober was nice. Mike a little drunk was even nicer. Mike quite drunk began to be objectionable, and Mike very drunk was embarrassing. And we actually see that in the novel later when Mike confronts Robert Cohn, one of Brett's other lovers, who's the hero of the book, according to this unpublished stuff. So the idea that Mike is an alcoholic was the kind of guy who just gets worse and worse and worse. And remember too that Hemingway's writing at a time when they did not have the knowledge we have about alcoholism as a disease with both genetic and social components. It was still seen primarily as like a moral weakness or something you could overcome with willpower. And just that's good to have in the back of the head as we talk about these historical representations of drinking culture. Next page, here's Brett being described. Brett was very different from Mike about drinking. Brett had a certain grand vitality. She had her looks too. She was not supposed to be beautiful, but in a room with women who were supposed to be beautiful, she killed their looks entirely. Men thought she was lovely looking and women called her striking looking. Then there's some description of painters always wanting to paint her and so on. Brett drank much more than Mike liked, but it never dissolved her in any way. She was always clear run, generous, and her lines were always as clear. But when she had been drunk, she always spoke of it as having been blind. Weren't we blind last night, though? It was short for blind drunk. The curious part was that she really became, in a way, blind. Drinking, and this does not mean the odd drink, 1 or 2 or 3 cocktails before dinner and wine at the meal, but real drinking of the sort that kills off the good drinkers, because they are the only ones who can do it, affected Brett in 3 successive stages. Drinking, say, whiskey and sodas from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until 2 o'clock in the morning, Brett first lost her power of speech and just sat and listened. Then she lost her sight and saw nothing that went on. And finally, she ceased to hear. And all the time, anyone coming into the cafe would never know she had been drinking. To anyone greeting her, she would respond automatically, "Hello, I say I am blind," or something of that sort. So we have a depiction here of some serious drinkers, to put it lightly. And the way that the drinking is depicted for the expatriates is, functions in part based on their class status. Jake actually has a job. He works as a journalist. And so he has to sort of do his drinking after work or on quick little getaways or the longer vacation like they take in Pamplona for the bullfights. Mike, on the other hand, is living on an allowance. Brett is living off Mike. All they do all day is drink because they got nothing else they have to do or maybe even want to do. And there's a lot of depictions in the book of people sitting around in cafes and the sort of nonstop socializing that included drinking. And the way that characters get introduced is almost always coming into a cafe or into a bar. Who they're with often can define them. And sometimes those definitions are maybe a little surprising from our perspective historically about what we expect from the 20s. So the first time we meet Brett, Jake has gone out with he's out having dinner and notices a prostitute looking for work. Jake invites her to join him for dinner, which is a bad idea because, as is made absolutely clear in the text and by some extra textual stuff Hemingway says, Jake has been castrated. He was a flyer on the Italian front, and those of you know anything about World War I airplanes, they were made out of wood and canvas for the most part, and small arms fire went straight up, and you were sitting on a chair, and if you got shot from below, so Jake has a wound that at one point he stands and looks in the mirror, he's naked, and thinks about it, and thinks about what the Catholic Church tells him to do, which is to not think about it. And so he cannot have standard normal, quote unquote, normal sex. But we know from extra-textual evidence from Hemingway and also from evidence in the text itself that he isn't completely castrated, he still has his testicles. Yeah, yeah, I'm sure. I'm not seeing all of y'all, which is probably for the better. So he's still got all of the, you know, hormonal drives that make him a man on some fundamental level, even if he cannot do more than that. Oh, somebody named Eric Johnson swooping in. I'm not sure what's happening with that. But I'm not, the questions will come in a moment, ladies and gentlemen. But when Brett first appears, she comes into this bar with a crowd of young men, some in jerseys and some in their shirt sleeves. I could see their hands and newly washed wavy hair in the light from the door. The policeman standing by the door looked at me and smiled. They came in. As they went in, under the light, I saw white hands, wavy hair, white faces, grimacing, gesturing, talking. With them was Brett. She looked very lovely and she was very much with them. This is a depiction of Brett coming into this bar with a bunch of gay men. Jake goes on, I was very angry. Somehow they always made me angry. I know you were supposed to be they are supposed to be amusing and you should be tolerant, but I wanted to swing on anyone instead to shatter that superior simpering composure. Instead, I walked down the street and had a beer at the next ball, which is like a chain of bars in Paris. He has a bad beer, he comes back, hooks up with Brett, who the first words out of her mouth are, hello, you chaps. Hello, Brett, I said, why aren't you tight? Never gonna get tight anymore. I say, give a chap a brandy and soda. She refers to herself as a chap. She wears men's style clothes. She is sexually in charge of her own world, not particularly caring about Victorian morality or the idea that, you know, men get to do what they want and women go along for the ride, so to speak. And so the main characters, the narrator and the primary love interest in Hemingway's novel that is dealing with the crisis of the modern and the question of whether or not there is anything meaningful to anybody else, is a castrated man and a woman who sexually behaves like a man. And once again, I'm trying to not look at the questions. So she's there. What we find out in backstory is that after Jake was wounded, she had been a nurse and he had been, actually that's in the first chapters, she had been a nurse and, you know, who tended to him after he got sent home from Italy or sent to England from Italy. One of the lines that makes it absolutely clear what has been sacrificed is also one of the lines that makes the novel's epigraph more meaningful. So he's describing himself being in the hospital in Italy, and an officer comes in to give him a medal. And he says, you, this is the officer speaking, Italian army officer, you, a foreigner and Englishman, any foreigner was English, have given more than your life. What a speech. I would have liked to have it illuminated to hang in the office. He never laughed. He was putting himself in my place, I guess. Che mala fortuna, che mala fortuna. So what bad luck, what bad luck. But you've given more than your life. One phrase that has totally lost its meaning from the Great War and the cultural period immediately after it is the phrase, the lost generation. And one reason it's the meaning of it has been lost is the epigraph to this novel, which is one of the two epigraphs, which is Gertrude Stein saying to Hemingway, you are all a lost generation. Originally, the lost generation meant two related things, not identical, but closely related. One, all the men killed in the war. And second, all the children who would never be born because those men were not alive to father children. And so when the Italian officer says you've given more than your life, it might seem to be one of those moments where a man is equating, you know, his penis with something more than life. But it's really, you aren't going to have any children, so you've given more than your life. You've given up the future lives of this lost generation. So this kind of thing is what the novel's about. Is there any way for meaning to exist in the modern world? The depictions of bullfighting in the novel are very much aligned with trying to find some kind of artistic meaning in the world. The bullfighter is depicted as a modern artist in some ways. Spanish culture in general, and I'll get back to this in a minute, is depicted as being before the war, being somehow fundamentally untouched by the war. And so a potential source of meaning is to go back before everything was destroyed and find a real thing, which is one of the phrases used to describe Romero, the bullfighter hero of the novel, who Jake sets up Brett to run off with. And in terms of, before we get to Spain, because I want to end with talking about the peasants and how their drinking culture is depicted, there's some really interesting stuff about Prohibition culture. One of the characters in the novel who doesn't get talked about quite as much is Bill Gorton, who is based on Robert McAlmon, a novelist nobody reads anymore, who did some really interesting stuff back in the 20s. And Bill comes to Jake's from Vienna, where he's been watching boxing. He's pretty much hammered all the time. He's one of these guys who drinks too much. But they take the train down to Spain, to Pamplona, and then up to into the Basque Hill country to go trout fishing on the Irati River. And the train ride south is really fascinating because it turns out that the train from Paris to, I'm forgetting where that train goes to, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, is full of Catholic pilgrims on their way to Lourdes. So the dining room is full and they can't get reservations for lunch. So much of this novel is about like when you're eating food and when you're drinking. And so they, you know, are sitting in their train car and like, oh, I guess we'll get sandwiches and a bottle of wine. And some other folks come in and, you know, just discover that they aren't going to get lunch, so they have to go get a second breakfast. And one of the priests who's leading the group of pilgrims goes by, and Bill says to him, "When do us Protestants get a chance to eat, Father?" "I don't know what you're talking about," the priest replies. "Haven't you got tickets?" "It's enough to make a man join the Klan," Bill responds. Yeah, this is the Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was part of the cultural phenomenon that led to Prohibition. The Klan was instrumental in supporting Prohibition and later being sort of vigilante enforcers of it in ways that helped lead to its repeal. But Bill's got this weird, you know, that moment is a moment that shows kind of the cultural fault lines that existed around Prohibition, between Catholic and Protestant, between rural and big city, between small towns and et cetera. And then later when they're up in the mountains, and I'll get back to how they got there shortly, Bill is always kind of joshing with Jake. So they're having coffee in the morning in the inn where they're staying at to go fishing. And he says, talking about you gotta have some caffeine. Nobody, you're an expatriate. This is Bill talking to Jake. One of the worst type. Haven't you heard that? Nobody that ever left their own country ever wrote anything worth printing, not even in the newspapers. You're an expatriate. You've lost touch with the soil. You get precious. Fake European standards have ruined you. You drink yourself to death. You become obsessed by sex. You spend all your time talking, not working. You're an expatriate, see? You hang around cafes. Sounds like a swell life, I said, Jake. When do I work? You don't work. One group claims women support you, another group claims you're impotent. No, I said, I just had an accident. And then there's some back and forth about where Bill's clearly like, oh shit, man, I've crossed a line here. And then he says a little bit later in their conversation, listen, you're a hell of a good guy, and I'm fonder of you than anybody on earth. I couldn't tell you that in New York. It didn't mean I was a faggot. That was what the Civil War was about. Abraham Lincoln was a faggot. He was in love with General Grant. So was Jefferson Davis. Lincoln just freed the slaves on a bet. The Dred Scott case was framed by the Anti-Saloon League. Sex explains it all. The Colonel's Lady and Judy O'Grady are lesbians under their skin. So he's kind of riffing off like a vaudeville comedian here about Jake's wound and trying to like, not make it a joke exactly, but try to make himself kind of emotionally connected with it, with Jake in some fundamental way. And that's what the positive drinking in this book tends to be about. It's about sharing drink with people who either you just met, but you want to be hospitable to, or with your close friends who you want to bond with. And, you know, they go fishing, they put some bottles of wine in a spring, so they're nice and cold. Bill asks a little, you know, there's a little bit more joking about the Anti-Saloon League, which was the organization that really got Prohibition passed. The WCTU was important, but they were not the sort of tip of the spear. And a little more banter. You're in pay of the Anti-Saloon League, Bill says to Jake. I went to Notre Dame with Wayne B. Wheeler, Jake replies. It's a lie, said Bill. I went to Austin Business College with Wayne B. Wheeler. He was class president. Well, I said, the saloon must go. You're right there, old classmate, Bill said. The saloon must go, and I will take it with me. Wayne B. Wheeler was the president of the Anti-Saloon League. the equivalent of Wayne LaPierre or an NRA leader. That was the NRA, or the Anti-Saloon League was the NRA of the 19th century, early 20th century, the laser-focused single issue political organization that got Prohibition passed. And Prohibition is something that everyone in Europe knew about, and that the Basque peasants, whose drinking culture directly conflicts with the expatriates, are aware of as well. So when they're getting on a bus to go from Pamplona up to the Irari River, they are on the bus with a bunch of Basque peasants, and this is the narration. A Basque with a big leather wine bag in his lap lay across the top of the bus in front of our seat, leaning back against our legs. He offered, they're riding on the top of like a double-decker bus. He offered the wineskin to Bill and me, and when I tipped it up to drink, he imitated the sound of a klaxon motor horn so well that I suddenly spilled some of the wine, and everybody laughed. He apologized and made me take another drink. He made the klaxon go off again a little later, and it fooled me the second time. He was very good at it. The Basques liked it. Like, so they're joking around. And as he said, they're sharing. Bill opens a bottle of wine to return the favor. When Bill opened the bottle the second time, he took a long drink because the first time they refused it. And then the bottle went all over that part of the bus. Everyone took a drink very politely. Then they made us cork it up and put it away. They all wanted us to drink from their leather wine bottles. They were peasants going up into the hills. So here's these poor people. I mean, they don't even have seats on the bus. They're lying across the roof, wanting to share their wine with these wealthy expatriate guys. They go into a cafe, it's stopping about 2/3 of the way up. We each had an aguardiente, and I paid 40 centimes for the 2 drinks. I gave the woman 50 centimes to make a tip, and she gave me back the copper piece, thinking I had misunderstood the price. 2 of our Basques came in and insisted on buying a drink. So they bought a drink, and then we bought a drink. Then they slapped us on the back and bought another drink. Then we bought. Then we all went out into the sunlight and the heat and climbed back on top of the bus. There was plenty of room now for everyone to sit on the seat, and the Basque who had been lying on the tin roof now sat between us. So the culture that is being expressed here is a culture of generosity and sharing and equality, which the best sort of drinking culture can sometimes promote, sometimes create. And then there's one last detail, and then I'll stop so we can have some conversation. Once they're back in Pamplona and the fiesta, the San Fermines begin, they keep going, like wherever the Jake and the other expatriates go, into the food shops and the wine shops, people have laid out spreads and are just like, eat. That's what it's there for. Help yourself. You don't have to pay anything. You're with us now. There's this sense of generosity. But there's also a really interesting bit about values is a phrase that comes up in the novel all the time. But they go in and the square was quiet in the hot sun as on any other day. The peasants were in the outlying wine shops. There they were drinking, getting ready for the fiesta. They had come in so recently from the plains and the hills that it was necessary that they make their shifting in values gradually. They could not start paying cafe prices. Prices doubled on everything during the fiesta. They got their money's worth in the little wine shops. Money still had a definite value in hours worked and bushels of grain sold. Late in the fiesta, it would not matter what they paid nor where they bought. So what I think this novel expresses about drinking culture in the context of the crisis of the modern and in the context of a search for meaning is that drink is kind of a neutral thing. It can be meaningless and lead to all sorts of trouble, as it does with Mike and Brett and with Jake quite often. Or it can be meaningful in that it promotes connection between people, that it helps people overcome barriers that otherwise exist. Like, we're a couple of American writers going fishing and you're a bunch of Basque peasants. We're all drinking wine together on this bus. We go into a bar, you buy one, I buy one, you buy one, I buy one. That kind of common identity can be built in the culture if you're aware of it and awake to it and willing to embrace it. So that's what I got to say about The Sun Also Rises. Whoever's moderating this thing can make us, hey, Lucas, I knew you were there somewhere. We can go to the chat room to share questions. I saw one earlier, Margaret. Yes, I believe Brett was a name that was gender vague on purpose. But lots of aspects of Brett aren't so gender vague. She's described as wearing a sweater and having curves like the hull of a racing yacht, which is the opposite of the skinny flapper thing that was the fashion at the time. she was still very much sort of traditionally feminine in some ways. But can we put it so I can see all the faces, Luke? I've just got one big one up. Or do I have to do that? There we go. There's everybody.
Over to gallery view.
Yeah, I think I managed that.
Yeah, great. So yeah, well, thanks. Thank you so much, Bill. Right. So if anybody does have,
I haven't had a drink all this time.
hey, yeah, quench that thirst there, Bill. You've been at it.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Seriously, everybody, we're not together, but we're not apart either.
Absolutely.
Uh-oh, somebody's empty though. Brett, gotta go refill.
Right.
So we could go via the chat room. We could go via live.
Yes, absolutely. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, by all means, feel free to do so, or type it in the chat if you're more comfortable with that. But Peter did have a question. Yeah. So why the Great War and not World War I? You alluded to that earlier, Bill.
Right. Well, yeah, this is something that I try to do with my undergraduates and my graduate students as well. When you say World War I, that's a little mental acknowledgement that World War II is between you and that. Calling it the Great War is a way of reminding yourself that that's what the people who were reading called it. They didn't call it World War I because World War II hadn't happened yet. So to imaginatively, to exercise what I call an historical imagination, I think, to try to picture intellectually, emotionally, what it might have been like to be in another place in time, and maybe to be a different kind of person than you are, or obviously a different person altogether in narrative fiction, is to try as much as possible to use the terminology of the day. So,
I get that now. So it's from the perspective of somebody reading in the 20s and 30s the book,
right.
Without putting a lens on it to say that there's been all this other stuff that's happened that we're aware of.
Right, absolutely. And like I said, history obscures as much as it reveals. Trench warfare was perceived as industrialized slaughter. And obviously the death camps of World War II were even worse. Genocide was another level of industrialized slaughter. So we lose track of how totally traumatic it was for the culture in general when we put those lenses between. So yeah, Peter, that's a really good way to put it. And oh, by the way, the only reason I don't have The Sun Also Rises from Off Color is they sold out, and when I tried to get some, they had no more. So.
See if you can see it. You snooze, you lose. You snooze, you lose, Bill.
I need one of those bottles anyway. Other questions?
I want to know more about the beer, Liz.
Oh, no, skip the beer for now. Margaret, you had a question? Unmute yourself, talk.
Oh, so I'm muting myself because the question might not be comprehensible. But it's interesting what you're saying about the Great War as opposed to World War I, because in the context, it is the Great War, as when the generation to say, okay, the war, maybe a generation a little bit before us, whatever, but the war is World War II. If the generation's a little bit later, it's like the war, it is the war in Iraq, maybe, or Vietnam, or the Cold War. I mean, there are so many, but it's interesting because in French, we say la deuxième guerre mondiale, meaning it's the second, and there could be a third, la troisième. If you say la seconde guerre mondiale, that just means you're done. There is no third. So they refer to it as la deuxième guerre mondiale, meaning there could be a troisième, quatrième, whatever. Who knows? But I'm just wondering if you had a comment about that.
Well, that's really interesting because the different linguistic ways of expressing order, right? In English, the second, there could be a third, but in French, they've got two different ways of saying that, one of which ends the sequence, another of which leaves it open. So that's
similar to the third. If there's only the three and there's no fourth, it's like le tiers état, like in the French Revolution.
Right.
It's the third state or whatever, le tiers état, and or tierce. There's only three.
Right.
I don't know. Well, or maybe there's a fourth, but anyway,
Well, one of the great things about this novel is you know, the American view on French culture at the time, where, and Hemingway relentlessly mocks two kinds of people. People who are in Paris who don't like it. Like, what's not to like about Paris? And Parisians who profit off the Americans, right? There's a great scene in one of the cafes where Bill and Jake are there, and they went to a particular cafe because Bill had been there right after the armistice. And McAlmon had served in the war as Hemingway had as well, or with the ambulance services Hemingway did. And, you know, the patroness of the cafe makes a big deal about them, but they still wait 45 minutes for a table. He says, "Wonderful woman, won't get us a table though," right? And then when they're leaving, the patroness says to Jake, "You know, we never see you anymore." And he's like, "There's too many foreigners." She's like, "Come at lunch, there's not so many then," right? So there's a lot of like that kind of insider stuff about Paris in this book that's really cool. Other questions, thoughts? Conversation is what we're here for. Nobody else read the damn book. I'm perceiving that, which is fine. It's a book club happy hour, not an actual class.
There was
I'm looking at the, Luke, you're in charge of the.
there was a quick question earlier by Alexandra, just wondering if you could repeat where she could find the missing chapters online.
The missing chapters, I don't know if they're available online. They were published in 1979 in the literary magazine Antaeus. But if you email me, I have a scan and I'll be happy to send it to you. Anybody who wants this, I can get you a copy. My email is b-savage@northwestern.edu. Eileen, you're unmuted. Talk.
I was just gonna say I read the book an awful long time ago. So.
And Meg asks if you've seen any of the film versions.
I don't think so.
Nope. You know, frankly, I've seen one scene from the 50s movie version, which had Eddie Albert playing Mike. I forget who played Jake. And it was so awful, I just couldn't keep going. But Hemingway's attitude about film is really interesting. He was asked what he thought about adaptations of his book, like the Humphrey Bogart To Have and Have Not, and, you know, what was his opinion about adaptations? And he was really cold. He's like, any writer should just drive to the California border, take their money they give you, hand them the book, and go back home and get back to work. Pay no attention to it. Like it's irrelevant. It's not your text. Don't worry about it. Take the money though, right? Because you got to make a living. So I have not seen any of the adaptations. Eddie Albert was a really convincing bad drunk, but I couldn't do it. Other questions? I could be trying to look at the chat, but I think it's easier if Luke moderates.
Yeah, we got a few more here. Jim is asking, Bill, what's the general public's acceptance and the reaction to the book?
The book was a bestseller. It helped make Hemingway even more famous. It was scandalous because it's non-judgmental about the sort of dissolute lives these characters are reading. And there was still a really powerful kind of critical structure that said novels are supposed to depict the world as it should be, not the world as it is. This is why we still talk about what's the moral of the story. Meanwhile, Hemingway, Dos Passos, Ford Madox Ford, Fitzgerald, Woolf, Joyce, all these other writers are saying, no, we're going to write about the world as it actually is in really complicated ways that are going to be hard for you to figure out, because that's what the world is, hard to figure out. So the conventional, it sold really well in general. It helped make Hemingway financially stable enough to start cheating on his wives and marrying new women. It made it impossible for him to write Farewell to Arms and the other books that came after. It didn't become a critical, like taught at university success for another 20 years, when the critics who grew up reading Hemingway became professors and started assigning it in class, basically. Way too much of book status any book status can be tracked to demographic changes in higher education. And once people who grew up on Hemingway were in charge, Hemingway became the template, along with Faulkner, for what modernist prose is supposed to be. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, Meg asks a question phrased as a comment. Wouldn't be a good guest on Jeopardy, Meg. No, I'm just teasing you. So I guess he wasn't fond of Steinbeck, considering he wrote a lot of film.
I don't know. Honestly, I'm not sure what Hemingway's opinion of Steinbeck was. Lots of writers did go to Hollywood and actually write for the movies. Faulkner did. Faulkner co-wrote the script for not Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep. Lots of Hollywood, and Chandler and others, or Fitzgerald went to Hollywood too. That's where he managed to drink himself to death. But in terms of Steinbeck, I think Hemingway probably, based on their different aesthetics, Steinbeck wasn't a complete Victorian in terms of telling you what to think, right? He still ends The Grapes of Wrath with that enigmatic image of Rose of Sharon nursing the man who's starving to death after her infant baby dies. And he doesn't say what it means. You have to figure it out. But it does have much more of a journalistic directness to it, as Dos Passos does in USA Trilogy and some other places. But Hemingway, his relationship with other writers was either cutthroat competitive or just ignoring them. So I apologize for not having a sort of an automatic answer to what did Hemingway think of Steinbeck. I do think, though, that For Whom the Bell Tolls is a novel Steinbeck could have written. It's just as explicitly political, in favor of the loyalist cause in the Spanish Civil War. So it's complicated. And none of these writers, we hold up individual writers like Eliot or Hemingway, or for that matter, Faulkner, as kind of templates. But writing is not that straightforward. Lots of different variations. It's spectrums, and it's well springs and confluences. It's not, Legos you can put together that'll always match. Next query.
I found that that passage you read about the Basque individual with, doing the klaxon sound. That was humorous but interesting, and just got me thinking about the various different opinions and perceptions of Europeans on American prohibition. And what little bit I've also gathered from watching Downton Abbey, they see Americans.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any additional thoughts or comments about European.
Well, one of the Basque peasants turns out to speak English and to have emigrated to America and lived there for 15 years and then come back. American stories of immigration and identity tend to emphasize people come here, streets paved with gold, or come here and encounter prejudice, but they stay here. Actually, lots of immigrants came here, made a lot of money, or a lot of money by the standards of their old country, and then returned, especially Greek, Italian, and Spanish immigrants, because the exchange rate was such that they could work, kind of working class jobs, but if they saved their money assiduously, they could go home and buy the farm, literally, as opposed to the metaphoric buying the farm of getting killed. And this guy talks to them explicitly, says, well, you can't get this back home. And Bill says, well, you can if you know where to ask. Right? So the cynicism about prohibition, where my favorite anecdote about that is one of the organizations that worked to repeal prohibition had a speaker who traveled around the country in the early 30s. And his shtick was, when he arrived in a town to give a speech in favor of repeal, how long would it take him to buy a drink before he got to where he was giving the speech? And the record was 30 seconds. He walked out of the train into a cab, and the cabbie offered to sell him a pint of whiskey. So, alcohol was one character in Dos Passos' Manhattan Transfer said the problem with prohibition is staying sober, because alcohol was everywhere. But Europeans tended, and if we forget this too, in the early, through the late 19th into the early 20th century, Europeans still, I don't want to say for the most part or all of them, because that's kind of stupid, but in general, European culture kind of looked at American culture as still a little backward, a little frontier, a little, cowboys and Indians and factories, and not genteel like Paris or London or Madrid. So that's part of this too. But again, the fact that the Basques he depicts are people with values based on work, hours worked, bushels of grain sold. That's what money is to them. It's not just a check that comes every 2 weeks. It's meaningful labor in the world. So that's a big part of that too. Other thoughts or questions? Other than I need a haircut like nobody's business, right? Don't we all?
Yeah, well, it was that one time a week when I do need a shave. That was yesterday morning. So
Yeah. I figure if I let the beard go, no one will notice the hair coming down.
it all evens out, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks. All right. Well, I think we're about out of time here, getting close to the witching hour, and my glass is empty. I don't know about y'all. Firstly, thank you, Bill, so very much again for
Thank you.
sharing
Well,
time
let
and
me-
expertise.
If I can take over for the 3 minutes we have remaining. One of the really great things about Hemingway is how accessible he is. His fiction is really straightforward. You can read and enjoy just depictions of the world. The great thing about Hemingway is when you slow down and keep in mind that anything he describes is the 1/8 of the iceberg above the water, and there's always something else going on. That something else is always going to be organically connected to the 1/8 above. And what rewards rereading and rewards deep reading is just slowing down and thinking about what might it mean that these Basque peasants are so generous? What might it mean that, these English aristocrats are such dicks when they're hammered, right? What's he saying? He's never going to come out and say what he's saying. He wants you to make the meaning. And, the world we live in now, I think as much as the world he was writing about 100 years ago now almost, is very much a world where there are power structures that want to hand you meaning that you will just nod and accept. And that it's incumbent on all of us instead to pay attention to what's being said and what's really being said at the same time, and try to get to a deeper meaning. And I'm not just talking about politics here, although I am talking about politics. And that's one of the things, the sense of crisis that the modernists were grappling with. Our culture's in that same crisis right now. What's really remarkable about literature of the 20s is how little the influenza epidemic gets mentioned. Like the influenza epidemic killed 2.5 times as many people as the war did. And writers just don't even mention it. I think it was too traumatic, right? And now we live in a world where we're in another pandemic, and who knows what's going to happen, when we'll be able to go to bars again, or theater, or baseball games, or just walk down the street without a mask on. We got to think about how these things signify and how the discourses of power work on us the same way Hemingway did during the First War, the Great War, where he said, nope, I'm not sacrifice. I don't know what that word means anymore. So I like to think that one thing that makes literature worth reading and thinking about is its applicability to our everyday lives. And its applicability to the worlds we live in now, as opposed to simply being either entertainment or object of study. It's both those things, but it's also germane to everyday life, I hope. All right, I'll get off my soapbox. I want to thank everyone for being here. If you want to, like I said, email me, and anyone who wants those first 2 chapters, I can send you a PDF of that. And anybody who's interested in, nominating other books for the future Brewseum Book Club, other leaders perhaps, hint, Liz, hint, you want to get an audience here? Please take advantage of email and other forms of connection. And meanwhile, be safe, be well. That's the most important thing right now. Cheers.
Cheers, Bill. Thanks all. We do have another session coming up on Friday at 5:30, May 22nd. If anybody wants to join, check that out. It'll be with Travis Rupp on the National Advisory Board, Chicago Brewseum, also of Avery Brewing Company out of Boulder, Colorado, and the University of Colorado Boulder. He's going to be speaking about George Washington's ale. So what George Washington So it's drinking and brewing. So talking about the Avery beer, George Washington's Porter, and just a great story behind all of that. So that's 5:30 Central Time, PM, Friday, May 22nd. And as Brett chimed in there, gonna miss these after the apocalypse, and it'll be interesting to see how museums are going to be functioning after once we begin to reopen. So I think digital has come on hard and fast, and virtual, and we're gonna see that it's not gonna suddenly stop once.
Right. It'll be complementary.
For sure. Absolutely.
All right. Thanks everybody. I'm out of here.
All right.
Peace.